Diversity is important for so many reasons, I think. You are never going to have the best candidates for any role if you exclude, looking at aviation, functionally 50% of the population. So in order to find the people that are most equipped for a role, you've got to look at everyone. Now, if a number of those individuals feel disenfranchised or unable to access that particular industry for whatever reason, how are you going to find the best candidates? There's also huge amounts of evidence that a diverse workforce leads to better outcomes, because that diversity of thinking, diversity of background and experience is really important in order to problem solve. It's also important, I think, because how do we inspire the next generation? Well, we find people who represent them. You get such a different viewpoint, or such a different experience, such a different level of excitement, I'm sure you've seen it yourself, of young girls who want to be pilots when they come into the flight deck for a visit and realise that there's a female pilot there, versus what it would be like for them if there was two blokes. So it's also about inspiring, and I think that does make a difference as well.
Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how important you think, or why you think mental health is important.
Sure. So I think over the years, especially in our industry, mental health has been considered something that's not really spoken about, because people are concerned for their livelihoods, because they feel that if they speak up, actually, they really do run the risk of losing everything. But that's just not the case. The Civil Aviation Authority, the NHS, whomever it happens to be, is incredibly supportive in terms of people dealing with mental health challenges. But equally, mental health is something that we all have. Much like physical health, sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. Some people are very, very lucky in that they don't tend to suffer from mental or physical health concerns. Some people will suffer from both, from either, throughout their lives at various times. And when you work in an industry that's quite macho, I suppose, or historically has been quite macho, there is a tendency for people to default to, no, I'm fine. But ignoring any mental health concerns, any struggles, actually just any days where it's all got a little bit too much and you just need a bit of a reset, is never going to make it better. It's just quite daunting, I think, for a lot of people to speak up.
Because I think in COVID, I noticed you were involved in a project, was it #pilots?
So yeah, we pilots, there was a couple of things actually. I was involved in a charity called Pilots Together at the time, and we were set up to provide financial support for pilots who had been made redundant as a result of COVID. And obviously there were a number of airlines who had made various pilots redundant and a few that collapsed at the time. So we were quite busy. But one of the things that was also identified at the time was that a lot of people within the industry didn't have a confidential method of speaking up if they were just having a bad day, or whether it was a full-on crisis. They didn't necessarily know who to turn to. So we set up a text crisis service with Shout 85258, and that enabled pilots to text in confidentially to the charity and just talk about whatever was on their mind. Shout's a great organisation. They provide literally just text crisis support for anyone. Everyone's able to access it. But we obviously focused on the pilot side of things for our kind of demographic. And since then, absolutely nothing to do with us at all, but since then the industry has changed insofar as the prevalence and focus on things like peer support programmes has increased. There's a number of organisations doing cross-airline peer support, which means you don't necessarily risk speaking to somebody who you might fly with the next day. And it is absolutely being taken more seriously. But yeah, that was kind of where we all started, was text crisis stuff.
Because one of our previous guests was saying about finding support, and that sometimes it can be too hard to speak, but if you're just texting, these organisations are fantastic, because you're still processing or going through whatever you are struggling with and need to talk about, as opposed to maybe picking up the phone could be just that little bit too daunting, but it's that interim step that can just help you stop going down that negative spiral if necessary.
Absolutely. But also I think as time moves on, the younger generations will always find it easier to text than speak, because that's the world they've grown up in.
Absolutely.
So it's a much more comfortable environment for a lot of people who are sort of turning 18 or so these days to be able to access that sort of support.
Were there any sort of common themes that you found pilots were talking about in particular?
So it was fully confidential. We didn't run it. We never ever found out what happened. We'd get an update of its usage, but we didn't get anything further. So we never really got the breakdown. And actually, I think that's probably the right way.
Yeah.
Because people, especially COVID, I think we were all so concerned for our livelihoods and we didn't really know what was going to come next, that it wasn't a normal representation of the industry. Had we run the same thing now, I think the results would be very, very different in terms of what people were concerned about. But you know what, it got used, the option was there, and clearly some people gained something from it. So,
do you know what the uptake was? You know, the number of messages that were received?
No, not necessarily. We know it was used. But we don't know anything further, really.
Oh, that's fantastic. So what advice would you give to anybody with regards to maintaining firstly maintaining their mental health, but maybe someone who's really struggling, and how they can, process that and move forwards and get the right support for their mental health?
So there are huge numbers of organisations out there who will offer that support. Whether that's Young Minds for young people, whether that's the Samaritans if somebody's in crisis. Obviously the NHS and GPs and stuff if you feel that that's the right environment. For anyone working, I think the big thing is feeling empowered to speak up within your organisation, even if it's just your manager, and say, I just need a reset. I need a couple of days just to step back and take some time for myself. Because the only way to solve a problem, it's like if you've got the flu. If you battle through it and keep going, you are never going to solve that problem because you haven't given yourself time to reset. If you're suffering with a mental health challenge due to an event especially, and you just keep battling through, it's exactly the same thing. You need to give yourself the space in order to reset.
I think, as you say, in the aviation industry, historically, we've been quite bad at that, of actually taking account of mental health and maybe taking some time back. Because like you say, it's like, if you're physically ill, you take some time off, and, mentally needing a bit of time, it's the same. But I think we're not always very good at joining the two. Was there anything in particular that inspired you to get involved in helping mental health, particularly during COVID?
Not specifically during COVID, but my father died, as I said, when I was 9, and he died by suicide. He was a pilot, and basically what had happened was when he had left the industry, he lost a lot of his sense of identity. Various challenges down the line as well. Obviously, that wasn't in itself the only thing. But when I looked at the parallels with that and COVID, we had a lot of people who had, through absolutely no fault of their own, been removed from the industry, whether they'd been furloughed for a period, whether they had been made redundant. And for a lot of them, it was that sense of identity. So there were quite a lot of parallels in terms of them feeling like, well, I am a pilot, but now I'm not a pilot because I've lost that role. So who am I? How do I define myself? And how do I rebuild myself in just about every way, especially in an environment where I can't just go out and see my friends. I can't just go down the pub and have a few drinks with the locals or whatever. It became more apparent than ever that support was needed, I think.
I'm so sorry about your father, by the way. But if the way you've turned that round to something positive, to help people, it's just sometimes just that one conversation can be enough to stop. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. So what advice would you give to someone in terms of how they can, if they are feeling, really like that there is no way of moving forwards, but of course there is, where would you say they need to go for advice, and what advice would you maybe share with them?
So and it sounds so cliched, but everybody has difficult days. How dark those days are depends on your individual circumstances, of course. But again, they do pass, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. And there are so many, as I said before, there are so many organisations who are there to support individuals who are struggling, whether that's Shout for text crisis services, whether that's Young Minds for young people, whether that's the Samaritans for any individual who's happy to call on the phone for those in crisis. NHS, whether that's going into A&E or going to a GP. The big thing really is speaking out. And it doesn't have to necessarily be to somebody who is in that position of authority, of responsibility. Speak to a peer, ask them for help. Certainly within the airlines, we all have access to the information that we can use. We can refer people on to peer support programs or whatever it happens to be in order to get them the support that they need. But the biggest step for anyone really is admitting that there is a challenge there and speaking up.
Absolutely. And in terms of, you and yourself, what do you do to maintain your mental health or to manage stress? Because, you're a really busy person and you seem to be spinning, juggling lots of plates.
Yeah, it's fine. If I don't look at them, I don't know they're there. Exercise for me is the big one. I know I'm getting tetchy and I've not done enough and I'm starting to get stressed, or my partner just goes, "Can you go for a run, please?" Like, right.
It's interesting what you say, though, that sometimes other people can give us like the best insights for ourselves. Like you're saying, your partner can say, "Just go for a run."
Yeah, go away.
Go for a run, come back.
And it does make such a difference, even if it's like super slow or super short or whatever. I find that getting out and physically pushing myself, I have to focus on things like keeping breathing. And it is enough just to reset my stress levels. Not fully, not for an awfully long time necessarily, but enough to be able to manage sort of the everyday pressures. And it's the best thing I can do, especially in a busy summer schedule. Making sure I make time for exercise is the one thing that keeps me sane.
So perhaps now we can talk a little bit about the importance of saying no, because I noticed recently that you stepped down from editing a magazine, an industry magazine. So perhaps you can talk a little bit about that and why you think saying no is important for us in terms of protecting our mental health and well-being.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've been involved with our union magazine for, I think, at least 12 years, possibly longer, as an editor. And it's been fascinating, it's been challenging, it's been hugely insightful over the years. But I recognised this year that with setting up a new charity and with my various other commitments, my time was getting quite short. And I looked at kind of all of my commitments and thought about where I'm not getting anything from it and where somebody else can step into the breach. Now, of course, there are always going to be days with certainly voluntary work where you're not necessarily getting anything from it, but your commitment and your input is quite important in a short period of time. Not getting anything from it is not the end of the world. But sometimes you just know that your time has come and you've kind of run that course with things. And being able to recognise that and just give yourself that tiny bit of time. And for me, I'm probably only getting back one day a year from doing that. But it's enough that I feel that I've given myself a little bit of space and that I'm not juggling quite so many things and dropping them quite so often. Because it was one side, I'd missed a deadline last month for something I was supposed to do. But I just thought, well, why did I miss that? Well, because I don't have the love for it that I used to. So the time has probably come to move on. I don't do it anything like as much as I should. Invariably end up saying yes rather than no more often. But you do have to give yourself that space, because otherwise you end up doing kind of half a job of things. And that, I think, is when you realise that it's probably time to crack on and do something else.
So talking about all these things that you are involved in, so one of the many things that you've done, which I'm really excited to talk about, is you've set up a new charity, Aviation in Reach. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. So Aviation in Reach was set up last summer. We provide mentoring opportunities from individuals from less represented demographics who aspire to join the aviation industry. So we cover military and civil aviation. We think we're the only charity that does that. Aspiring pilots, air traffic controllers, engineers, and specifically military, but loadmasters. And what we're offering to these individuals is somebody who is either like them, who comes from a less represented demographic, or who is an ally, who understands the challenges they may face in accessing those particular industries, whether that challenge is visibility, whether that's cultural, whatever it happens to be, offering them a mentor who can give them a touch point, who can give them confidence, who can give them a genuine insight into the industry to help level the playing field a bit before they join. And it's been so fascinating. You know, I've learned so much about things I didn't understand about cultural challenges people have, especially with joining the military. Certain cultures where that's just not really a thing. But of course, the individual, especially if they've grown up in the UK, you know, their cultural framing is very, very different.
And have you ever set up a charity before? I'm guessing this was the first time you'd done this.
So I was involved with setting up Pilots Together during COVID, albeit slightly less so. I was a trustee of the charity there, whereas I set up the charity with Aviation Reach. And yeah, it's been a serious learning curve.
So how have you found the journey?
It's been really interesting. So I've had the idea for some years because I just couldn't work out in my own head why we live and work in an industry which just isn't changing in terms of its proportions of women, especially because of course that's the thing I see most often as one of the individuals involved. So we've had all these great ideas that some companies and stuff have come up with to increase the number of women in aviation, but they don't really work. It's a bit of tokenism. They might affect one individual and it's great for that one individual, but what can we actually do to increase the balance across the industry? And one of the things I'd never really seen tried was mentoring. So that's kind of where it all came about. And then finding the incredible group of trustees that I've got to run the charity was a bit of a tapping into kind of a lot of my contacts situation. And I couldn't be happier with who we've got. I think they're an absolutely fantastic team of people with such a diverse set of backgrounds who bring so many different things to the charity. And I think the biggest and most eye-opening moment was when I was on the phone to various people and sort of said, right, this is my idea. And I expected people to go, what are you on about? What are you talking about? And they kind of went, yeah, you know what? I think that's a really good idea. I'm really on board with this. And it grew legs from there of this silly thought I'd had for years to people genuinely believing in that as a mission. It's kind of been mad.
It's sort of going out of your comfort zone as well, isn't it? Where you're scared to tell people about it because you think that they're going to dismiss the idea and say, why are you doing this? You know, no, it's never going to work. But you tell one person and they go, it's a great idea. And then you tell more people and they go, that's a great idea. And then it kind of gives you the confidence as well to sort of grow the charity. But it's that leap of faith that you have to take. So what could you share with our viewers and listeners with regards to just pushing themselves out of their comfort zone and taking that leap of faith? Maybe that brilliant idea that you've had with Aviation and Reach, maybe their own brilliant idea.
I think the biggest thing is not to think too hard about it, because had I thought about, okay, so if I say this to this person and they say yes, then we're going to have to do this step, this step, this step. Then we're going to have to deal with the Charities Commission. Then we're going to have to deal with this. Then we're going to have to get a bank account. If I'd thought that far ahead, I probably wouldn't have done it because it was a huge amount of work. So taking things step by step is so important in terms of pushing yourself outside of your comfort zone. Yeah, there are going to be other moments of going outside of your comfort zone and learning new skills and jumping over ridiculous hurdles that you didn't even know existed once you start. But you know what? That's tomorrow's problem. That is for a different day. One step at a time is the only way to tackle those sorts of challenges, I think.
Definitely those incremental gains, because if you think, you're going from here to here, it can seem really daunting, but if you break it down, incremental gains is actually really quite powerful. So now tell me a bit about being awarded an MBE. So many congratulations for that. So when was that?
So that was the New Year Honours List 2022, so the beginning of 2022. And it's a military MBE, so went through the Air Force. Who knows? You don't really get much information about how it happened, but yeah, it came from the Air Force, which was pretty special. And it was essentially a combined award for charity work with Pilots Together at the time, the RF Air Cadets, and mental health campaigning.
And how did it feel being awarded an MBE? Were you surprised? Did you know what was happening?
So you get a phone call. Certainly for the military ones, you don't get the opportunity to say no. So if you're a civilian, you can turn them down. With the military one, you're not allowed to say no, which is fine. I'm not sure I would have done anyway. But you get a call a couple of days before the list gets published, just to say, by the way, this is going to happen. And the Commandant Air Cadets rang me, it's a completely unknown number on my phone, on the sort of 30th of December or whatever, just say, right, hi Katy, this is who it is, and here's the news. I hope you've got some champagne in the fridge. It's like, well, funny old thing, no I don't, because I wasn't expecting the phone call. But it was such a short phone call in the grand scheme of things, and quite rightly so, that I didn't really have time to process. I thought it was a bit of a joke. I was like, it's odd. So you kind of sit and you think about it for a while, message a few people, and sort of, you're not really allowed to tell anyone, but you're allowed to sort of tell your immediate family and stuff. Messaged a couple of people and said, right, I've been told this. I don't really know what to make of it. And obviously it wasn't a joke, but it wasn't probably until I saw the list come out from the Air Force that I genuinely believed it. Because it's just, in my world, these things don't happen to people like me. So it was a completely new experience again.
So would Katy at school have felt that an MBE would have been achievable?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It would never have crossed my mind that that was a possibility.
So what would you say if you could go back to Katy at school?
I'm not even sure I'd bother to fill that conversation, because I'd probably just tell you that it was a lot of rubbish. I mean, I believed that 2 days before it was announced by the Air Force. So go back 15 years, not a chance would I have believed a word of it.
So obviously part of Aviation in Reach's mission, it's increasing diversity within the aviation industry. So why do you think diversity is important?
Diversity is important for so many reasons, I think. You are never going to have the best candidates for any role if you exclude, looking at aviation, functionally 50% of the population. So in order to find the people that are most equipped for a role, you've got to look at everyone. Now, if a number of those individuals feel disenfranchised or unable to access that particular industry for whatever reason, how are you going to find the best candidates? There's also huge amounts of evidence that a diverse workforce leads to better outcomes, because that diversity of thinking, diversity of background and experience is really important in order to problem solve. I mean, that in itself is possibly less relevant in most flight deck environments, but actually it's not always irrelevant. It's also important, I think, because how do we inspire the next generation? Well, we find people who represent them. You get such a different viewpoint, such a different experience, such a different level of excitement. I'm sure you've seen it yourself, of young girls who want to be pilots when they come into the flight deck for a visit and realise that there's a female pilot there, versus what it would be like for them if there was 2 blokes. So it's also about inspiring, and I think that does make a difference as well.
Well, how do you think we can benefit as an industry from increased diversity?
So there's huge amounts of evidence as to why it makes a difference. The diversity of thinking on a board, for instance, having those different backgrounds, those different experience levels, enables such a wider range of opinions, such a wider range of viewpoints, that I suppose gives you a better opportunity to find the right or the most correct viewpoint. Diversity of thinking has also been proven to increase safety levels, and again that diversity of thinking kind of covers the backgrounds, your different socioeconomic backgrounds, gender backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, whatever that happens to be, but it does increase safety levels. And again, because sort of coming back to what we spoke about a bit earlier, if people feel included and represented in their working environment, they are much more likely to engage fully. Now, how do you enable somebody to feel included and represented? Well, you make sure they're not the only one, that they're not excluded by a lack of numbers or kind of whatever it happens to be in that particular environment.
And you touched also just now on women in aviation. What do you think we can do to increase the number of women in the industry?
So the biggest thing in my view is enabling people to understand what the key skills really are. There's a huge amount of focus when it comes to, when I talk to my cadets and stuff, when I say, right, what skills do you think matter to be a pilot? And they kind of go, oh, you need to be really good at maths, and you need to be really good at physics. And I just don't think that's true. There's a lot of focus on the technical aspect of things, which of course is important, but it's far from the be all and end all. And helping people to understand, especially young people to understand, that things like emotional intelligence, communication skills, the non-technical, or what some people call the soft skills, on a day-to-day basis are more important than having great physics knowledge, I think is the biggest factor. The aviation industry of today is so different to what it was in the 50s and 60s. In the 50s and 60s, absolutely having those great technical skills mattered. And it still does today. But we live in an environment where the technical element is firstly so complicated compared to what it used to be, but also so much safer and so much more redundant, that actually the non-technical elements are probably the most important aspect, in my opinion, of kind of getting through a day and enabling the safest outcome possible.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of people I speak to, when I say flying is like a day at work flying an aeroplane, flying is actually only a part of the day, they assume that your whole day is about the actual physical flying of the aeroplane. And I remember someone once saying to me, I didn't look big enough to fly an aeroplane or strong enough, because, if you say back in the 50s and 60s, it was a very different beast to now. But like you say, it's the soft skills, it's the managing people, it's the managing resources, it's the CRM, the crew resource management. And actually that brings me on to the next thing, so human factors. I noticed that you've taught human factors. So why do you think that's important now in the aviation industry?
So the aviation environment, especially commercial aviation, is so safe because we've got so many levels of redundancy before most elements fail, certainly within Western-built aircraft. And we've designed out a lot of the technical challenges. If we think back to barely over 100 years ago, aviation was in its absolute infancy, and the leaps that we've come on in 100 years, from that to supersonic aircraft to incredible fast jets and where we're at now with today's airliners, there's been such a rapid development in terms of how things have changed, that we had a situation to start with where they were learning as they were going with the technical elements, like the Comet, when they put the fuel tanks in the wing with the engine and didn't necessarily consider the consequences of putting everything as an inbuilt design, to now where we've designed out a lot of the major structural errors and the technical errors and risks. That where do things go wrong? Well, it's the human element. It is the human factors side of things, whether that's fatigue, whether that's stress, whether that's emotional intelligence, whether that's simply just factors of human behaviour that mean that people respond to certain things in a certain way. That is where the marginal gains in aviation safety are. And that's why it's so important, because that's where we can make the industry even safer and even more effective than it is now.
So Katy, thank you so much for sharing your story with us today. It's been incredible to hear your really inspirational journey and everything that you've been involved with, and obtaining an MBE at such a young age, that's such an achievement. And I'm wishing you all the best for the future, and I really can't wait to hear what the future holds. I'm really looking forward to hearing about Aviation in Reach, because it's a very new and very exciting charity. And I look forward to seeing where that takes us with regards to changes in the aviation industry in future. So thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your story.
Thanks for having me.
You're welcome.